Isolation leaves us vulnerable. Isolation is a weakening force for a person, a community, a people. That's the message Draugen wants us to come away with, but I ultimately wonder if the game itself fell prey to the trap of isolation itself, as I feel the game's tale is incomplete. I'm not saying anything revelatory. The fact that there isn't really an ending is part of the experience, and it should be stated at this point there are going to be spoilers. So what led me to add to the pile of middle-aged white dude navel gazes about an artsy video game videos? Maybe this feeling in the pit of my stomach that I don't fully know what to take away from this game. The feeling of incompleteness gnaws at me, and maybe that's an intended effect. Given Draugen was likely in production well before its May 2019 release date, I find it unlikely that Red Thread Games planned for the theme of isolation to be as timely as it ended up being. With quarantine giving us all a new appreciation for isolation's effects, both positive and negative, it ends up casting all of this game's narrative in a new light. Even if you, like me, missed the boat by about 4 years and didn't pick up this game until the autumn of 2023 because you thought it might be a good, short, spooky game to play while your friends were too busy for you to screen share Final Fantasy XVI with them. I'm noting the coincidence of my own isolation as I embark upon this. Borrowing here from the game's PSN store listing, Draugen is presented as thus. The year is 1923. You play Edward Charles Harton, an American traveler and increasingly unreliable narrator who's come to Norway to find his missing sister. But you're never alone. Every step of the way, Edward is accompanied by his ward Lissy, an independent and enigmatic young woman. Together you must explore a forgotten coastal community nestled amongst the fjords and mountains of rural Norway, in your search for Edward's sister, and unearth the darkness that lies beneath the picturesque surface. Let's home in on that last phrase, unearth the darkness that lies beneath the picturesque surface. I suppose that ultimately, given my state of mind, the time of year, and other factors, nonetheless the title, a Norwegian folklore spirit that heralds death, I was expecting horror or thriller, or I'd put the final result as closer to something from Graham Greene or Walt Whitman. And don't worry, I'm not going to dust off English papers here. More that it feels like it's going for something more cultural, spiritual, and nature-focused than what I expected. More Leaves of Grass than Lovecraft, if you will. The game, at least the environment, is gorgeous. In this, I feel the game succeeds with a glowing mark. There's little doubt that you're in a small hamlet in the Norwegian fjords, and there are several interactions devoted to your protagonist drawing them. Interactions I wasn't sure how to exit for a moment there, but I digress. It's in these moments that I initially thought to be just window dressing, that I should have paid maybe a little bit more attention. They're your first sign that this game has much more to do with said protagonist, Edward Charles Harton, than the erstwhile mystery that he finds himself thrust into against his will. As I'm reading this back, I'm realizing that maybe this is more a treatise on the clash of my own expectations versus what the game wants to present. If you're familiar at all with the hero's journey, and you always felt that refusal of the call never got its chance to shine in a starring role, then this just might be the game for you. It's in the refusal of the call that the true narrative of this game comes to light, and why I feel that regardless of what story the game was trying to tell, it came away with holes. As we begin the narrative experience to which I might charitably call a walking simulator, you arrive in Gravik, take several breaks while walking up a hill, find your hosts are nowhere to be found, and discuss the dual tasks that brought you here with your ward, Alice, or Lissy as she's usually called. It does seem rather funny to open by talking about isolation and not open with the fact that there are two characters present, both with diverging opinions about how to go about solving the mystery of Gravik and finding Edward's sister Betty. I suppose I buried that lead on purpose. Side note, you're going to hear Lissy and Betty's names a lot, thanks to the game's feature to call for people with the push of a button. Anybody who has ever pressed X to Jason and Heavy Rain knows very well how immersion-breaking that can get. However, it is entirely unfair for me to make the game responsible for my sense of being an occasional chuckle fuck, so we move on. That disagreement of objective, usually meant to establish the clashing styles of two protagonists in detective stories, is played absolutely straight in the game's first half. Hardin is the pragmatic, scholarly, and disbelieving Scully to Lissy's worldly and ready-to-believe Mulder, though the Sister Seeker is the opposite this time. It's in this sleepy, perhaps a little too slow to start opening that we learn that there's more to Lissy than her quirky, turn-of-the-century catchphrases that always sound off coming out of a modern-sounding voice. Side note, please, for the love of all that is holy, in the year of our Lord 2023, do not call your friends old fruit, I beg you. Lissy's dedicated to finding the truth about the people of Gravik, getting to the bottom of why exactly there's no one else here. Hardin, for his part, is dogmatically devoted to tracing the steps of Betty, despite increased warnings from Lissy that he's just going to get his heart broken. There is a growing division between these protagonists that, quite intentionally, mirrors the division between two brothers in Gravik, whose feud tore the town apart. But there's another element to how these two characters interact that booms to the forefront halfway through. I clocked Lissy as knowing way more than she let on right from minute one, but how the game pays it off is frankly its best moment. I'm going to warn you one more time about spoilers. We are jumping off the deep end here. The solve the disappearances of Gravik versus Find Betty disagreement reaches its head as a record of births and deaths in town leads Edward to dig up a grave out of worry it's his baby sister, as the more spiritual Lissy tears into him for the action, causing him to shout for her to leave him alone. And she does, vanishing before our eyes, taking the mystery narrative with her for the rest of 2 more chapters. Edward is alone. He has always been alone, and with only his delusions to keep him company. It's this character story that had me leaning forward in my seat, fascinated to see where it all goes, as Lissy goes from joking to cutting, peeling back layers and layers of Edward to make it more obvious that isolation has driven this man to hate himself and feel he deserves the pain that his own mind, which Lissy is now dishing out. This, however, is also the game's most out-of-left-field moment, as an angel statue joins Lissy to tell Edward just how much he sucks. She's not heralded before this arrival, and unless you decide to read the comics in the extra portion of the menu, you'll have no idea she's the manifestation of a statue at Edward's family home. Ultimately, where this character dressing down ends for now, is that perhaps Edward isn't alone. He's got Lissy and the angel statue always with him. But is that a positive? I feel like the game wants us to see it that way, but I saw a much darker interpretation of their platitudes. For these characters that had been so cold and abrasive to Edward just moments before, now intoning that they're on his side, felt hollow. To verbally scar you, throw your parents' deaths in your face, and then practically in the same breath say they're always there for you, well, that's not companionship. That's abuse. However, this is Edward doing this to himself, truly, and we are often our harshest critics. Isolation breeds that. Isolation gives you time to think. But when you do thinking too much, and your thoughts manifest into an angel statue who fiercely reminds you how terrible you are, maybe that's gone too far. But speaking of going too far, I guess the game got cold feet after the moment because the very next chapter seems to be quite the backpedal. Those characters who always committed to being with Edward, gone. Edward agreeing to maybe just ease up on Operation Betty Hunt just a wee bit, swings back full circle, to the point that the call for Lissy button becomes the call for Betty button for a whole chapter. And the mystery forgotten in those moments is now back to the forefront, with the death of the child Ruth at its core. What did she find in the mine, or re-find, that set off the cascade of events that brought Gravik to a low, where they felt God had abandoned them? Edward lumbers his way back onto the trail, but now committed to the case because Betty was committed to the case. Which in hindsight kind of seems like Lissy could have just told him, we should solve the case because your sister wanted to, and that might have just done the trick. If you were hoping for a neat pin in the case, the game goes through several pieces to assure us that will never happen. The mine shaft collapses, and though we get a brooch out of it, it feels like we hit a wall in terms of where the mystery was meant to go. One last beeline back to the house where we've started each day to discover emphatically that Edward lost his grip on reality long ago. Betty, or who he presumed to be Betty, has been dead for decades, and every artifact he's found of hers is just a random clothing item, an actress's picture, or a brooch of Viking origin that promised it some mystical element that never really materialized outside of Edward's own head. The resolution of the case is anything but. With not enough true clues to close the loop, something Edward ironically warned Lizzie about early on, you're left to guess. Was Ruth murdered by her cousin to keep Viking treasure hidden so a mine could operate? Was it a horrible accident that led the town to tear itself apart out of paranoia? And why did Edward feel drawn to this tiny lost town in Norway in the first place? No concrete answers await these questions. As if to echo the true crime podcast that will come 100 years after the story's setting in 1923, Edward and his delusions are left to affirm they'll wildly speculate at the answers and write about it. Because if you're telling the town's tale, you might as well exploit it for money. Edward is American, after all. Ultimately, isolation is a whole, and so is Draugen. From the mystical creature of the title that never appears outside of a book drawing, to the unanswered hole in the case, to the remaining question of if Edward really should be considered healed or not, Draugen seems to have something innately missing from its tale. And maybe again that was all intentional. Maybe we, like Edward himself, are brought to Gravik by Red Thread, thinking we'll find a mystery, or answers, or even a distraction from our own isolations, which have featured so heavily in all our lives as of late. The question of what now gnaws at my mind as I watch the credits roll, and it occurs to me that I've played out this adventure basically as isolated as Edward, and that isolation leads to a vacuum, which nature abhors. Edward leaves Gravik commenting on how peaceful it is and how much better he feels on the last day, but I don't believe him. He's still a lonely man who concocted several spirits and aspect that could turn on him at a moment's notice if he strays too far from their perceived correct path. His perceived correct path. Maybe what I'm feeling isn't a hole, but a razor's edge. Maybe that's what isolation is, and maybe that's what Red Thread was trying to get across with this incomplete parable. I can't say I fully enjoyed the experience, but it has stuck with me to the point I was willing to take this dive into it. We search for meaning, even in the places that rub us raw. Draugen will hang with you, and at least leave you longing for autumn leaves, the lap of water, and the wind off a bay, and all those thoughts that nature can bring when you're on your own.